April 12th, 1945. The Hague, German-occupied Netherlands. The sky is empty. It has been empty for months now, except when the bombers come. When the sound of engines reaches this city, people do not look up anymore. They press themselves against walls, into doorways, beneath tables. They wait for the tremor, the flash, the collapse. They have learned that survival sometimes means not seeing the sky at all. But on this Thursday morning, there is only silence. A terrible, hollow silence that settles over streets where grass now grows between the cobblestones, where windows are broken and never repaired, where the smell of cooking has disappeared so completely that people have forgotten what it was like to wake to the scent of bread. In a fourth-floor apartment overlooking the Lange Voorhout, a woman named Hendrika van der Meer stands at her window. She is 42 years old. She looks 60. Her dress hangs from her shoulders like a sheet draped over furniture. Her face is all angles now. Cheekbones, jaw, the ridge of her forehead. Her hands shake constantly, a tremor she can no longer control or hide. Below her window, a child walks with his mother. The boy cannot be more than 7, but he moves like an old man, slow and careful, as if his bones might shatter with each step. His legs are sticks wrapped in cloth. His mother holds his hand, but she does not look at him. She stares straight ahead, at nothing, her eyes the eyes of someone who has stopped expecting the future to arrive. Hendrika turns from the window. On her kitchen table sits the day's ration. 3 potatoes. Not large potatoes, not fresh. They are sprouted, soft in places, the flesh dark with rot. But they are potatoes. She will boil them in water to make soup. The water will have more flavor than the potatoes, but the warmth will matter more than the taste. This is what life has become in the winter that will not end. This is the Hongerwinter. The hunger winter. The winter when the war did not simply touch Holland, it consumed it. The people of the Western Netherlands believed in the autumn of 1944 that liberation was days away. When the Allies landed in Normandy in June, when Paris fell in August, when Brussels was freed in September, it seemed impossible that the war could last much longer. The people prepared. They hid Dutch flags in attics. They whispered about what they would do when the Germans finally left, how they would celebrate, what they would eat. Freedom felt close enough to taste. And then the winter came. Not liberation, winter. In September 1944, the Dutch government in exile called for a railway strike to support Allied operations. The Dutch railway workers obeyed. Trains stopped running across the country. The strike paralyzed German logistics and military transport. It was an act of resistance, an act of courage. It was also an act that would cost tens of thousands of lives. The German occupiers retaliated with precision and cruelty. They imposed a total blockade on the western provinces, north and south, Holland, Utrecht. No food could enter by rail. No barges could move through the canals. Roads were closed. The most densely populated region of the Netherlands, home to more than 4.5 million people, was cut off from the rest of the country. The Nazis called it a punishment for betrayal. The people called it something else. Slow execution. By November, the food began to run out. By December, people were eating tulip bulbs. By January, they were eating anything that could be chewed. Leather belts, wallpaper paste, grass boiled until it formed a bitter soup. The official ration dropped to 580 calories per day, then 400, then lower. In some areas, people received no ration at all for weeks. The winter itself was merciless. It was one of the coldest on record. Canals froze solid. Fuel disappeared. People burned furniture to stay warm, then floorboards, then doors. Trees vanished from parks as families tore them apart for firewood. Entire neighborhoods were dismantled piece by piece, consumed by the need to survive one more frozen night. Children stopped playing. Old people stopped speaking. The city became a place of silence and slow motion, where every movement required calculation, where every step drained energy that could not be replaced. The human body, when starved, begins to feed on itself. Muscles dissolve first, then fat, then organs. The heart weakens. The brain slows. People developed edema, swelling caused by the body's desperate attempt to retain fluid. Their faces became masks. Their limbs became grotesque parodies of themselves. By February 1945, more than 300 people were dying every day, not from bombs, not from bullets, from hunger. In a makeshift hospital in Amsterdam, Dr. Willem Ari van der Klei moves between beds that are not really beds. They are tables, boards, sheets stretched across crates. There are no medicines left, no bandages, no anesthetic. He cannot save anyone here. He can only watch them fade. In one corner, a girl of 16 lies curled on her side. Her name is Marieke. She has not spoken in 3 days. Her pulse is faint, irregular. Her skin is cold to the touch. She weighs less than 70 pounds. When Dr. van der Klei lifts her wrist to check her heartbeat, her bones feel like twigs beneath paper. He knows she will not survive the night. He has known it for days. He also knows there are 6 more patients exactly like her in this room alone, and hundreds more throughout the city, and thousands beyond that. The numbers are beyond comprehension, beyond grief. Grief is a luxury for people who still have the energy to feel. He sets her hand down gently. He moves to the next patient. He does what he can, which is nothing. Outside the city, in the countryside between The Hague and Rotterdam, a farmer named Peter de Vries stands in a field that has been stripped bare. The Germans took his livestock in 1943, his grain in 1944. Now they have taken his seed potatoes, the potatoes he saved to plant in the spring. Without them, there will be no harvest. Without a harvest, there will be nothing to eat in the summer, the autumn, the winter beyond. Peter does not protest. He has learned that protest leads to arrest, and arrest leads to execution or deportation. He watches the soldiers load his seed potatoes onto a truck. He watches the truck drive away. He goes back into his house and tells his wife what has happened. She does not cry. There is nothing left to cry about. They sit together in silence, staring at the walls, waiting for whatever comes next. This is what the people of Holland understand about the war in April 1945. It is ending, but not for them. The Allies are advancing from the south and the east. Germany is collapsing. Everyone knows this. But the German forces occupying the Western Netherlands remain. They are trapped, isolated, cut off from the rest of the Reich. But they are still here, still armed, still capable of destroying whatever they choose. And the people are too weak to resist, too weak, in many cases, to walk, too weak to think clearly, to plan, to hope. Starvation does not simply take the body. It takes the mind. It takes the will. It leaves behind only the instinct to survive one more hour, one more day, one more breath. When the bombers pass overhead now, British Lancaster heavy bombers flying to targets deeper in Germany, people do not wonder if they will be hit. They wonder if it would be better if they were. At least it would be fast. At least it would be over. April 27, 1945. Achterveld Airfield, Allied-occupied Netherlands. The Lancaster bomber sits on the runway, engines idling, its metal skin reflecting the pale morning light. Inside the cockpit, Flight Lieutenant James Crawford checks his instruments one final time. Altimeter, fuel, compass, everything is in order. But something feels wrong. Something feels impossible. The bomb bay is full, but there are no bombs. Instead, sacks of flour, crates of canned meat, boxes of powdered milk, and chocolate. Hundreds of bars of chocolate wrapped in waxed paper, nestled in wooden crates stamped with the Red Cross insignia. Crawford has flown 43 missions over Germany. He has dropped incendiaries on Hamburg, high explosives on Berlin, blockbusters on the Ruhr. He has seen cities burn. He has watched tracer fire arc toward his wings. He has brought his crew home through flak that turned the sky into a metal storm. He knows what bombers do. They destroy. But today the orders are different. Today he is supposed to save lives. The briefing this morning was unlike any he had ever attended. The commanding officer stood at the front of the room and said words that made no sense. You will fly at 400 feet. You will fly slowly. You will not take evasive action. You will drop food supplies to Dutch civilians in German-occupied territory. The Germans have agreed not to fire. You will not fire on them. A murmur had moved through the room. One pilot raised his hand. Sir, are we meant to trust the Germans not to shoot? Yes. And what if they do shoot? Then you will be flying at 400 feet with a bomb bay full of flour sacks and no defensive capability whatsoever. So let us all hope they honor their word. Silence. Then someone laughed. Then everyone laughed because the alternative was unthinkable. Now, sitting in his cockpit, Crawford does not laugh. He thinks about altitude. 400 feet. That is lower than most flak towers. Lower than church steeples in some towns. Low enough to see faces in windows. Low enough to be hit by small arms fire if someone below decides the truce does not apply to them. He thinks about his crew, his navigator, his bomb aimer, his gunners. 7 men whose lives depend on German soldiers keeping a promise. He thinks about the people below, the Dutch. He has seen the intelligence reports. He knows what is happening in the cities. He has heard the estimates, 20,000 dead. Maybe more, maybe many more. He has never met a single one of them, but today he is supposed to keep them alive. The radio crackles. Lancaster Zebra, you're cleared for takeoff. Crawford pushes the throttles forward. The engines roar. The bomber lurches down the runway, heavy with its cargo of mercy. The wheels lift, the ground falls away, and for the first time in 5 years, a British bomber flies toward Holland not to destroy, but to deliver hope. The negotiation that made this mission possible was one of the strangest diplomatic encounters of the war. It began not with governments or generals, but with a phone call that should never have been possible. In late April 1945, the Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte managed to arrange contact between Allied commanders and the German Reichskommissar in the Netherlands, Arthur Seyss-Inquart. The message was simple. The Dutch are starving. Will you allow food to be delivered? Seyss-Inquart was a Nazi administrator. He was responsible for the deportation of Dutch Jews. He had overseen the execution of resistance fighters. He had enforced the policies that led to the Hongerwinter. But now, in the final weeks of the war, he was also a realist. Germany had lost. The Reich was disintegrating. Continuing to starve 4.5 million people would achieve nothing except to guarantee his own execution when the war ended. He agreed to a meeting. On April 30th, Allied and German representatives met in a schoolhouse near the village of Achterveld. The absurdity of the scene was not lost on anyone present. British and Canadian officers sat across a table from Wehrmacht commanders and SS officials. They drank tea. They discussed logistics. They argued over routes and drop zones and the placement of white crosses to mark safe areas. They spoke politely, professionally, as if they had not spent the past 5 years trying to kill each other. The agreement was extraordinary. Allied bombers would drop food supplies to designated areas in the occupied Western Netherlands. German anti-aircraft batteries would not fire. German troops would not interfere with the drops or attempt to seize the supplies. The Dutch civilians would be allowed to collect the food without reprisal. It was a truce within a war, a pocket of sanity inside madness, and no one knew if it would hold. April 29, 1945. The first mission, Operation Manna. The bombers came in the early afternoon, Lancasters, Halifaxes, Stirlings, 242 aircraft in total, flying in formation over the flat green fields of Holland. They flew low, so low that people on the ground could see the markings on their wings, the rivets on their fuselage. The sound was immense, a deep throbbing roar that shook windows and rattled doors. In The Hague, Hendrika von der Meer heard the engines and moved away from the window. She had learned to fear that sound. But then she heard something else. Her neighbor, Mevrouw Bakker, shouting in the hallway. "They are not bombing! They are dropping food! Come, quickly, come!" Hendrika thought the woman had lost her mind, but others were running into the street now, pointing at the sky. Hendrika moved to the window and looked up. The bombers were overhead, no more than 400 feet above the rooftops, and from their bellies, sacks were falling. Not bombs. Sacks. White sacks tumbling through the air, parachutes blooming above them, drifting down like strange mechanical snowflakes. People poured from their houses. They ran into the streets, into parks, into any open space where the supplies might land. They moved faster than they had moved in months, propelled by something stronger than their own exhaustion. The sacks hit the ground with soft thumps, splitting open, spilling their contents onto the grass. Flour, canned meat, sugar, powdered eggs, margarine, and chocolate. Bars and bars of chocolate scattered like treasure across the ruined city. A boy named Franz was the first to reach one of the sacks. He was 9 years old. He had not eaten anything but tulip bulb soup for 3 days. He tore open a box and pulled out a chocolate bar. He held it in his hands, staring at it as if it were something holy. His mother caught up to him, grabbed his shoulders, and began to cry. She did not tell him to share. She did not tell him to wait. She nodded, and he tore open the wrapper and bit into the chocolate, and his mother covered her face with her hands and wept. Across the city, the same scene repeated itself 1,000 times. People laughing, people crying, people embracing strangers, people falling to their knees in the middle of the street, clutching sacks of flour against their chests as if they might vanish. Old men who had not smiled in months stood on street corners with tears streaming down their faces. Children danced, mothers sang. And overhead, the bombers circled once, slowly, before turning east and climbing back toward Allied lines. Inside the Lancaster piloted by James Crawford, the mood was strange, subdued. The bomb aimer, a young sergeant named Robert Hughes, sat at his station staring at his empty hands. He had released the cargo with the same precision he used to drop bombs. Carefully timed, carefully aimed. But this time, when the sacks fell away, he had watched them drift downward, parachutes unfurling, settling gently onto the ground below. He had seen people running toward the drop zone. He had seen them reaching up, waving. Some of them had held white sheets, flags, anything they could find to signal gratitude. Hughes had flown 31 missions. He had never seen people wave at him before. Usually they ran from him. Crawford's voice came through the intercom. "Navigator, set course for home." The crew was silent on the flight back. No one made jokes. No one sang. They had done something that felt sacred, something that could not be diminished with words. When they landed, the ground crew asked how it went. Crawford just nodded. "It went," he said. They flew again the next day, and the next, and the next. Over the next 10 days, Allied bombers flew 3,156 sorties into occupied Holland. They dropped 6,680 tons of food supplies. The drops became a routine. Launch at dawn, fly low, release cargo, return to base, refuel, repeat. The bomber crews developed a rhythm. The Dutch civilians learned where to go, when to expect the aircraft, how to distribute the supplies once they landed. But nothing about it ever felt routine. Nothing about it ever felt normal. In Rotterdam, a woman named Johanna Smit stood in a park with her daughter, watching the bombers pass overhead for the 3rd day in a row. Her daughter, Annika, was 6 years old. She'd been 4 when the war began. She had no clear memory of life before the occupation. She did not remember abundance or safety or joy. Her entire childhood was hunger. Johanna held her daughter's hand as the sacks drifted down. When one landed nearby, she let Annika run to it, watched her tear it open with a strength that surprised them both. Inside, canned corned beef, flour, and a small bag of sugar. Annika held up the sugar, her eyes wide. "Mama, what is this?" Johanna felt something break inside her chest. Her daughter did not recognize sugar. She had forgotten what sweetness tasted like. Or perhaps she had never known. "It is something good," Johanna said. "Something very good." They carried the supplies home. Johanna used the flour to bake bread that night, the first bread she had made in 7 months. The smell filled their apartment, seeped into the hallway, drifted into neighboring rooms. People knocked on their door just to stand in the threshold and breathe. No one asked for food. They just wanted to remember what it smelled like. Johanna gave Annika a slice of bread with sugar sprinkled on top. The girl ate slowly, carefully, as if each bite needed to be saved, memorized, preserved. When she finished, she looked at her mother and said, "Can the airplanes come again?" "Yes," Johanna said. "They will come again." And they did. For the bomber crews, the missions became emotionally complex. Flight Lieutenant Crawford found himself thinking about the drops at night, lying awake in his bunk while the rest of the barracks slept. He thought about the people below, the faces he had glimpsed from 400 feet. He thought about the difference between what he was doing now and what he had done for 4 years before. He had dropped bombs on cities. He had killed people. He knew this. He did not think about it often, because to think about it would make the work impossible. But now, dropping food instead of explosives, he could not avoid the comparison. The same aircraft, the same altitude, the same precision, but an entirely different outcome. One night over drinks in the officers' mess, another pilot named Thompson asked him, "Do you think this makes up for it?" Crawford knew what he meant. "No," he said. "Then why does it feel like it does?" Crawford had no answer. The German soldiers stationed in the occupied zone watched the drops with emotions of their own. They had been ordered not to interfere. They obeyed. But obedience did not mean indifference. In a gun emplacement near Scheveningen, a Wehrmacht corporal named Dieter Hoffmann stood with his men watching a formation of Lancasters pass overhead. The anti-aircraft guns were loaded. The crews were ready, but the order to fire never came. One of his soldiers, a young private from Bavaria named Klaus, said quietly, "We could shoot them down." "Yes," Hoffmann said, "we could. But we will not." "No, we will not." Klaus was silent for a moment. Then, "Why are we still here, Corporal?" "The war is over. Everyone knows it is over. Why are we still pretending?" Hoffmann did not answer, because there was no good answer. They were here because they had been ordered to be here, because desertion meant execution, because the machinery of war did not stop simply because the outcome was inevitable. It ground on until it finally broke apart, and no one knew exactly when that moment would come. Below them, Dutch civilians moved through the streets carrying sacks of flour. Children ran with chocolate bars. Old women sat on doorsteps eating bread. They did not look at the German positions. They did not acknowledge the soldiers at all. It was as if the Germans had already ceased to exist, as if they had become ghosts haunting a country that no longer belonged to them. Hoffmann turned away from the sight. "Stay at your post," he said. "That is all we can do." Not every drop went smoothly. On May 3rd, a parachute failed to deploy, and a sack of flour hit a building in Amsterdam, punching through the roof and landing in an attic where a family was hiding supplies. No one was hurt, but the impact shattered the floorboards and sent a cloud of white flour billowing through the apartment below. The family emerged from the wreckage looking like ghosts, coughing and laughing, covered head to toe in white powder. On May 5th, strong winds carried several crates off course, and they landed in a canal. Dutch civilians waded into the freezing water to retrieve them, forming human chains to pass the crates to shore. They worked for hours, their clothes soaked, their lips blue with cold. But they did not stop. They saved every crate. And on May 7th, the last day of Operation Manna, a Lancaster developed engine trouble during a drop run. The pilot could have abandoned the mission, turned back, saved his crew the risk. Instead, he completed the drop, released every sack, and then limped back to base on 3 engines. When asked why he had not aborted, he said, "We had the food. They needed it. There was no other choice." The impact of the drops extended beyond the physical nourishment. For the people of Holland, the sight of bombers bringing food instead of death represented something profound: the possibility that humanity could persist even inside war. That mercy was not extinct, that the world beyond the occupation had not forgotten them. Dr. van der Kley, the physician in Amsterdam, saw the change in his patients immediately. It was not simply the calories, it was the hope. People who had been too weak to lift their heads now sat up. People who had stopped speaking began to talk again. Not because their bodies were healed. Starvation does not reverse itself in days. But because their minds had rediscovered something to hold on to. One of his patients, the girl named Marika, survived. She should not have. She had been within hours of death. But when the first food arrived, her mother brought her a piece of bread soaked in powdered milk. Marieke ate 3 spoonfuls, and then another 3 the next day, and then more. It was not enough to restore her health, but it was enough to keep her alive until liberation came. When Dr. van der Kley saw her again 2 weeks later, walking with her mother through the hospital ward, he did not speak. He simply nodded. She nodded back. Both of them understood what had been given and how close it had come to being too late. May 5th, 1945. The last drop. The bombers came one final time, flying low over The Hague, over Rotterdam, over Leiden and Haarlem and Amsterdam. They came in the late afternoon, when the light was golden and soft, and the shadows stretched long across the streets. The people gathered in parks and fields, holding white sheets, waving flags, shouting words the crews could not hear but understood anyway. Flight Lieutenant Crawford made his final pass over the Hague, releasing the last of his cargo. He watched the sacks tumble away, watched the parachutes bloom, watched the people below surge forward. And then he pulled the Lancaster into a slow, sweeping turn, one last circle over the city before heading home. He would fly no more missions. The war in Europe would officially end 3 days later, but for him, it ended here, over Holland, with sacks of flour and bars of chocolate falling like blessings into the hands of the starving. The people of the Netherlands did not forget. When the war ended, when the German forces surrendered, when the occupation finally lifted, the Dutch did not celebrate with parades or speeches. They were too exhausted, too hollowed out. But they remembered the bombers. They remembered the food. They remembered that in the final, darkest days, when death seemed certain, mercy had arrived from the sky. Hendrika von der Meer kept one of the chocolate wrappers. She pressed it flat, stored it in a book, and carried it with her for the rest of her life. When her grandchildren asked about the war, she did not tell them about the bombings or the arrests or the hunger. She told them about the day the bombers brought chocolate. She told them how it felt to taste sweetness again after so long without it. She told them that even in the worst moments, humanity could still surprise you. Johanna Schmidt baked bread every week for the next 40 years, even when flour was plentiful, even when there was no reason to commemorate anything. She baked it because the smell reminded her of the moment she realized her daughter would survive, that they would both survive, that the world beyond the war still contained kindness. Dr. von der Kley wrote a letter to the Royal Air Force after the war. He tried to explain what the food drops had meant. He crossed out the letter and wrote it again. He crossed it out again. Words felt insufficient. In the end, he sent a simple note. You saved lives. I cannot count how many, but I saw them. I held their hands. Thank you. The letter was filed in an archive. It was never answered. It did not need to be. In 1970, a ceremony was held in the Netherlands to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the liberation. Veterans of the bomber crews were invited. Many attended. James Crawford was among them. He stood in a park in The Hague where, 25 years earlier, he had dropped sacks of flour and cans of meat. Now, the park was filled with flowers and trees and children playing. A monument had been erected, a simple stone marker with the inscription, "In memory of those who brought us hope from the sky." An elderly woman approached him. She was small, bent with age, her face deeply lined. She looked at his uniform, at the insignia on his jacket, and she said in accented English, "You flew the bombers." "Yes," Crawford said. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, faded piece of waxed paper. He recognized it immediately. A chocolate wrapper. British military issue, 1945. "My daughter," the woman said. She was 6 years old. She had forgotten what sweetness was. "You reminded her. I never thanked you." Well, Crawford felt something catch in his throat. He did not trust himself to speak. He nodded. The woman folded the wrapper carefully and put it back in her purse. She touched his hand briefly, gently. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Crawford stood in the park for a long time after that, watching children play, watching families sit together on benches, watching life continue in a place that had once been so close to death. He thought about the bombers. He thought about the drops. He thought about the strangeness of being remembered not for what he had destroyed, but for what he had saved. He thought about the difference between the two, and whether it mattered in the end. It did. He decided it did. The operation itself became a footnote in history, a brief anomaly, a moment when the rules of war bent just enough to allow mercy through. Military historians studied it for its logistical complexity. Humanitarian organizations cited it as an early example of airdropped aid. But for the people who lived through it, it was something else entirely. It was proof that the war, no matter how total, no matter how consuming, could not erase every act of decency, that soldiers trained to kill could also choose to save, that bombers designed to destroy could be repurposed to deliver life. And it was proof that even in the final, desperate days of a collapsing occupation, when both sides had every reason to continue fighting, they could still agree on one thing: that starving children should be fed. Annika Smith, the girl who did not recognize sugar, grew up to become a teacher. She taught history. Every year, on May 5th, she brought her students to the park where her mother had collected food from the sky. She told them the story. She told them about the hunger. She told them about the chocolate. She told them that war is not simply soldiers and bombs, but also choices. That every person, in every moment, decides what kind of world they will create. Some of her students believed her. Some thought she was exaggerating, but every year, she told the story anyway, because it was true, and because truth does not require belief to remain truth. She kept her mother's chocolate wrapper, passed down when Johanna died. It sits in a frame on her desk now, faded and fragile. When students ask about it, she lets them hold it. She watches their faces as they realize what they are holding. A piece of paper, a wrapper, a relic of mercy from a time when mercy should have been impossible. This, she tells them, is what remains. The bombers are gone now. The crews are gone. The people who stood in the streets and waved at the sky are gone. But the memory persists. It lingers in archives and monuments, in letters and photographs, in stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren, and sometimes, on quiet spring afternoons in the Netherlands, when the sky is clear and the light is soft, old men and women will stop on the street when they hear the sound of aircraft overhead. They will look up, not with fear, but with something else, something complicated, something that cannot be easily named. Remembrance, perhaps, or recognition, or simply the knowledge that the sky, which once brought only terror, also brought, just once, for 10 days in the spring of 1945, chocolate instead of bombs. And that has to mean something. It has to. Because if it does not, then nothing does.